I wanted to start with something highly controversial, because that's just fun. I want to start really at the beginning, and last year I didn't really do any of this. I want to spend a little bit of time on, as it says in the subtitle, why things are the way they are as cast, as described in Old Testament theology. Why the innocent suffer, why people suffer in general, but even including and especially the innocent. And why people are the way they are. So the rest of the morning, in two parts, we're going to consider this. Because there are a number of really big picture themes. If you remember the four big ideas, one of them was conflict. And in the succeeding slides, I had notes about chaos and evil and enemies and things like that. From the very beginning of the biblical story, there are certain elements that are going to be either in the world because God was content to do things a certain way based upon certain decisions God makes that, for lack of a better term, bind him by his own will to have things be a certain way, and that create the possibility for evil, for suffering, but God deemed that better than any other way. But for us, we suffer under the consequences of that decision, but we are also what we are because of that decision, and we also have incredible blessing because of that decision. And so I want to talk about the Old Testament worldview concerning these things, because all of the bad stuff in here, one of the aims of eschatology in biblical theology, eschatology referring to the doctrine of end things, end times. One of the specific trajectories and goals of eschatology or biblical theology is the ultimate reversal of all these things. And so there will be, again, threads started here, words, symbols, images that you will see again deliberately in both the Old and the New Testament, because the writers are tracking the progress of certain ideas. It's leading somewhere, and it will have a denouement, at some point, a climax. When we get to New Testament prophecy, God has a goal that you can better understand the way the Bible ends in the book of Revelation if you understand the imagery of how it begins, because that's where it's leading. We are heading forward into the past in biblical theology. We are going forward back into Eden. Okay? So with that said, I'm going to talk about these passages this morning. We have Genesis 1, the first three verses a little bit, Genesis 1:31, then a passage in Genesis 2. And I want to talk about creation, and I'm using the word chaos, and I will define that as we go. Genesis 1:1-3, familiar passage to all of you. I have it because I'm the writer here. That's displayed the way it is for a reason. It's not just bad formatting, okay, in PowerPoint. It's that way for a reason. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then we have a parenthetical thought in verse 2. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was upon the face of the deep, Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. End of parenthetical thought, and God said, "Let there be light." And in verse 31, at the end of the chapter, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So I'm taking these two passages, and now we're going to talk about them and what's contained in them. Not so much what happens in between, but there are certain ideas communicated in the first section first three verses, that will make verse 31 seem kind of odd. Like, why did God say it was good when he gets to the end of the passage? Again, I realize it's fuzzy now, but just hang with me here. Some questions. Prior to Genesis 1:1 through 3, had God created anything else prior to this? Did any of you think of anything? Okay, go ahead.
Well, if the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the face of the deep existed.
That would be correct.
So it was
Repeat that for the tape. For the
Okay. She said if the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep, then that deep, whatever it was, had to be there prior to let there be light and all that kind of stuff. Now again, if you're thinking, well, how does that work scientifically? You're already lost. Okay, because they're not theoretical physicists in the second millennium BC. They're going to use images and ideas to communicate some simple but profound thoughts, but the way they do it will not only reflect what we think of as science today, but that's beside the point. That isn't what it's intended to be. The way they do it will be to use that as a vehicle to communicate certain really important theological ideas about those three questions that I introduced the session with. You know, why is the world the way it is? You know, why do people suffer? You know, all this about, you know, why do unpredictable things happen, you know, to good people and so on and so forth. This is actually going to lead to addressing questions like that. Does evil exist yet? You know, prior to Genesis 1:1? Okay, that's a question. Where was God's co-creator, his agent of creation? You say, what co-creator? Well, isn't Jesus cast as co-creator? Where is he? And where does that idea come from? Are there other creation accounts in the Old Testament? Are there any other passages in the Old Testament that describe creation? There are. Are they like this? Yes and no. There are similarities, and there are some real kind of odd differences. Is creation perfect? When God is done at the end of chapter 1, is creation perfect? And I'm using that word deliberately. Okay, we're going to hit these questions. We'll start with the first three. Job 38, the sons of God are around before God starts doing what he does in Genesis 1. We know that from Job 38. You know, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Again, laying the foundation of the earth, that's language that draws on Genesis 1 about, you know, having the dry land appear out of the primeval sea and all that stuff. You know, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. You know, God's going after Job here a little bit. On what were its bases sunk? Again, this is all ancient Near Eastern cosmology. The view in the ancient world was that the earth was round and flat. It rested on foundations, sometimes called pillars, sometimes bases like this. It has cornerstones. It's described as a building. The earth itself is described as a building with something underneath holding it up. Then the mountains are described as the pillars that hold up the sky. The firmament, in Hebrew it's the rachiah. The rachiah is a dome that covers the earth. It was conceived of as solid. I'm not really going to go through cosmology this time. We did that last time. During Q&A, if we want to go through cosmology, we can. But Proverbs 8, Job 37 talks about the firmament being a solid brass. You could knock on it. The stars were fixed to it. There's all sorts of passages in the Old Testament that talk about primeval cosmology. And this is the same as it is anywhere else in the ancient Near Eastern world. The Bible uses even the same terms that you'll find in other texts. So before all that, there was the sons of God. They're watching. Like, this is kind of a cool show. You know, we get to watch God do this neat thing that's going to produce the heavens and earth that humans will experience. You know, their reality is different. They're off planet, so to speak. But they get to watch what's going on. Other sons of God, Elohim, were present at least prior to Genesis 1:9. And the reason I put 1:9 in there is we have this heavenly host language. There's no suggestion that they are evil. You know, at least anything clear in the text. But they're there before God does what he does. What about the co-creator? This is the other question that I raised. So we have passages in the New Testament that clearly say, hey, you know, like there's two there. Jesus is the agent of creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth. Ooh, in heaven and on earth. Well, does that mean like the spiritual realm or just the atmosphere? Could be either or, could be both. But Jesus is prior. He is the agent for creating all these things. And then we look at the line that ensues. Oh, well, I guess it is the unseen world. Thrones, dominions, rulers. You mean even before the sons of God? Even before like the heavenly host, Jesus was there? Yeah. He is the agent for creating all these things. 1 Corinthians 8, although there be so many so-called gods in heaven and earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there's one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. So again, it's this idea that Jesus is the agent of creation. Proverbs 8. This is the co-creator passage in the Old Testament. Now, I have here verse 1. So Proverbs 8, verse 1, 2, and then I go down into the 20s because I wanted to fit it all on one screen. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? Female. You know, on the heights beside the way at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Get out of verse 22, the character of the whole chapter is wisdom. So wisdom says, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work. Possessed is in boldface for a reason, because we're going to talk about that word. The first of his acts of old, ages ago I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. So like there's somebody with God before creation. In the Old Testament, that person is cast as female and called wisdom. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, before all this stuff, I was there. Who is wisdom? Wisdom was the agent, but what does that mean? Now, I'm going to use some passages from apocryphal books that the Jews knew because the New Testament will touch on, will draw information from some of them, but they're also helpful. To a Jew, wisdom was God's co-creator. Well, that's profound. That's right in Proverbs 8. Okay, but there's more to it than that. I'll tell you what wisdom is, how she came to be. I'll hide no secrets from you, so on and so forth. So we have this character, another passage. Wisdom, the fashioner of all things, taught me. She is a breath of the power of God, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore nothing defiled gains entrance into her. Here's the key passage. She is a reflection. Greek is apagasma, of eternal light, a spotless mirror, the working of God, an image of his goodness. Okay? Keep this in mind. Wisdom, God of my ancestors, Lord of mercy, who have made all things by your word. By your wisdom you formed humankind. So whatever this character is, he has a role in humankind. Give me the wisdom that sits by your throne. Wisdom is sitting next to God on a throne. With you is wisdom, she who knows your works and was present when you made the world. Again, this book is just drawing on Proverbs 8. Send her forth from the holy heavens, and from the throne of your glory send her, that she may labor at my side, so on and so forth. Wisdom is in the assembly of the Most High. That's the divine counsel. I dwelt in the highest heavens, my throne was in a pillar of a cloud. Well, wait a minute. Who's in the pillar of cloud in the Old Testament? God. Who's in the pillar of the cloud here? Wisdom. Who else is in the pillar of cloud in the Old Testament? Oh yeah, Mount of Transfiguration. But even back in the Old Testament, you have the angel. The angel is in one passage, it seems to be the same yet distinct from the pillar. Just flying through here, and I'll connect the ideas in a moment. Now, by the time you get to the New Testament, Jews believed in two at the beginning. Proverbs 8 and this other stuff predate the New Testament. I spent a lot of time last year talking about the Jewish Godhead. Okay, two Yahwehs, one visible, the other invisible. Co-identified yet distinguished. The angel was but wasn't Yahweh, just like Jesus is but isn't God. He is God in essence, but he's not the Father. All this talk. It's Jewish. Here you have Jewish idea of a co-creator from the very beginning. And there were words used of that co-creator like eternal, okay, enthroned, okay, all this kind of stuff. When you get to the New Testament, look at what Luke does. Luke writes this episode about Jesus. Jesus is the speaker. He's railing against the Pharisees. Woe to you, lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, blah, 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 blah. Woe to you, you've built the tombs for the prophets that your fathers killed. He comes down here and says, Jesus is saying, therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute. Who does the Old Testament have sending prophets and apostles? Apostles just mean sent ones. God. So Luke has Jesus merging wisdom and God. Okay, he substitutes wisdom, the wisdom of God, for something that we know God was doing in the Old Testament. It gets even odder. Matthew's version of the same episode, Jesus says, therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes. Matthew identifies Jesus with wisdom, who Luke identifies with God. This is how a Jewish thinker would process Jesus. This is why Jesus is considered the co-creator. Because Jesus was wisdom, wisdom was God. They're all the same, but they're different. Why is wisdom feminine in Proverbs 8? Anybody remember? We touched on this real briefly last year. Because the Hebrew word for wisdom is grammatically feminine. Grammatical gender has nothing to do with real gender. Grammatical gender is a means of classifying nouns so that they agree with certain verbs. That's all it is. That's why German, das Mädchen, little girl, is neuter. Germans know that little girls aren't neuter. They're little girls. They're female. Grammatical gender has nothing to do with biological gender. We don't use case endings, what are called case endings in English, but we use gender like this. We refer to ships in the feminine. Okay, we refer to ships or nations as her or she, her people. Well, why is it feminine? Well, it's because of the history of the English language. The word that we now use for city or ship comes from some other language that was grammatically feminine. That's just the way it is. It has nothing to do with real gender. And they knew this. But what they were tracking on was the idea of two, from the very beginning, God and the agent of creation, whom they identified with Jesus. The writer of Hebrews makes this absolutely explicit, if you know what you're looking at. Wisdom of Solomon said, she is a reflection, apagasma, of eternal light. Wisdom is the apagasma. Now look at what the writer of Hebrews writes. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance, the apagasma, of the glory of God, and the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. Now, you can't appreciate this until you realize apagasma appears one time in the Septuagint, in that Sirach passage that I showed you. It doesn't even occur outside the Septuagint. It is an extraordinarily rare word. There is only one place the writer of Hebrews could have gotten that word in this context, and it's that passage that I showed you a few slides ago. There is no doubt that the writer is taking that word from that passage and saying it's Jesus. The whole reason I'm going through this is to answer that initial question. Has anything else been created prior to this time? Well, yeah, you got sons of God. Does evil exist yet? You know, I think at best it's ambiguous. I don't see any clear evidence that it exists yet. Where was God's co-creator? The co-creator was right there from the very beginning, before we had anything, before there was a universe, before there was matter. The co-creator was there. Okay, Jesus was there. So yeah, there's something going on before Genesis 1. What about the rest of this stuff? Are there other creation accounts? Are they like this? And critical question, is creation perfect? Before I hit the next slide, what I really mean by the question, is creation perfect, was it all God wanted? Was the entire creation Edenic? Okay. Was it exactly as God wanted it? Or was it just pretty good? We're going to hit both of those questions now. I just want, in your mind, to be thinking about, okay, maybe there's something about creation that I've missed here a little bit. Alternative creation passage. Now you look at the bottom. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun, fixed all the boundaries of the earth, made summer and winter. Again, that harkens back to the Genesis, creation of the heavenly hosts for times and seasons and all that stuff. So this is very clearly Genesis language right here. And you think, oh, Psalm 74, yeah, we're talking about creation there. Yeah, we are. Here's the rest of it. God is my king from old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided, separated the sea. Remember in Genesis 1? The waters are separated. But now wait a minute. Okay, you divided or separated the sea. The word sea there is Hebrew yam. That'll become important in a moment. You broke the heads of the sea monsters. Where's that in Genesis? Tanin, also translated elsewhere as dragons, plural. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. Holy cow, where does Leviathan come in Genesis 1? And what in the world is this? Leviathan, now we're in the wilderness? I thought we were back in the sea. I mean, what's going on here? You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him his food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open the springs in the brooks, again, division of the water. You dried up the ever-flowing streams. Well, you know what? Is it watery or is it dry? I mean, what in the world's going on here? But this is connected to this. There's some relationship here we can detect. So it kind of looks like creation, but it kind of doesn't. It's different than Genesis 1. What in the world is he doing? Like, this doesn't the guy who wrote this, like, is he clueless? I mean, how can you mess up Genesis 1? I mean, come on. How easy is that? Psalm 89. The heavens are yours, the earth also is yours. The world and all that is in it, you have founded them. Again, a very pithy, simple statement of creation. Don't really get any detail. Here's the rest of it. O Lord God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, with your faithfulness all around you, you rule the raging of the sea. There's the sea again. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab, like a carcass. Okay, before it was Leviathan, now it's Rahab. By the way, this isn't the Rahab of the Joshua story. She's not around in the primeval sea floating around getting beat up by God, okay? This is just Rahab. It's a proper name. Crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. And the result, or seems to be, the heavens are yours, the earth is yours, everything's hunky-dory. Everything's great now. What in the world is going on? I'll show you what's going on. The reason this is easily understandable now, you think easily, yeah, right. Okay. When I tell you this, it will be easily understandable. But the reason it's easily understandable now is because in 1929 we had a truckload of tablets discovered at a place called Ugarit that have in their contents stories that are a lot like Psalm 74 and a lot like Psalm 89. And we get a fuller context for them. Ugarit was the center of Baal worship, so they were Israel's neighbors. Baal worship, of course, was the bane, of the Old Testament prophets. Always had to deal with it because it was like right next door, and it keeps like leaking over, into Israelite territory. There are important word-for-word parallels between Ugaritic myths and Old Testament passages that the writers will use to communicate certain ideas. Why? Because, like it or not, because Baal worship was so popular, hey, and wouldn't a fertility cult be popular? Like the whole sexual worship, okay, that was Baal worship. Israel constantly drifting into it. But it was so popular, these stories and myths are well known. By the way, they are well known into the Roman period. This isn't just an Israelite thing. They are very similar to, again, these Psalms and other passages because the biblical writer wants to say, no, what you believe about Baal is false. Baal is not a good guy. Baal's not the creator. Baal's not, fill in the blank of all this neat stuff. Baal is a jerk, okay? Baal is somebody to avoid. Baal is evil. Yahweh is the one who should get credit for this stuff. And so they'll use certain things to communicate certain ideas. And part of that are these terms. In what's called the Baal cycle, the big story, the major story, is there's a fight between Baal, whose name means Lord, and Yam, okay, same word as in the Psalms, the sea, and Mot, which is death. This is also the biblical Hebrew word for death. Yam is also called Nahar, the river. Remember the brooks and the streams of the two Psalms. Yam is also described as a dragon, Tanun, remember Tanin, and a seven-headed monster called Litanu, which is the Canaanite word for Leviathan. It's spelled differently in Hebrew because of the dialect. In these stories, Yam, or the sea, represents the forces of chaos, disorder, disruption, something that needs to be brought under control. And that's the way it's going to be used in the Old Testament. In this story, Baal is the one who brings control and goodness to the earth. And the biblical writer wants to say, no, it's not Baal who did this, it's Yahweh who did this. That's why, again, they're using parts of it. Baal does that by killing the dragon, the forces of chaos. Baal eliminates or subdues the forces of chaos and gives us our nice, orderly, created world. Because the biblical writers want to defeat Baal as getting credit for this, they will use this sort of terminology. Baal is also described as the rider in the clouds, the Most High, and those things get used too in the Old Testament. So what we have here in Psalm 74 is the God of Israel doing the stuff that happens in the Baal story. Because the theological point is, first of all, the right God should get credit for it. Second of all, I want you to see that certain of these terms, Yam, Sea, Tanin, Litanu, Leviathan, just the words themselves, in the mind of the reader and the hearer, when they heard those terms, those names, they thought disorder, chaos, unpredictability, something that can explode at any moment and harm us. Okay, something that needs to be brought under control. Because when it's under control, things function pretty well. But there's always a threat that something can, it can break forth and we can be harmed. Again, Old Testament has creation texts. Psalm 74 is the best example, where creation, the idea of creation, is the subjugation or control of the forces of chaos, bringing order out of disorder. Now we're going to get to the question of, what about Genesis 1? So it does this by symbology of a battle between God and a sea dragon. Everybody in the ancient world who read a story about God, a God, and a battle of a sea dragon knows what that's about. That's about how we got the nice, orderly world we have now. The gods have to be responsible for that because we didn't make it. Right? My neighbor didn't make it. It didn't make itself. Has to be a power outside it to bring it into order. Right? Chaos, again, functions as a metaphor for God bringing order from disorder. Let's go back to Genesis. So we have here in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We have this parenthetical thought. The earth was formless and empty, and God said, "Let there be light." So if you read this quickly, you might wonder, where's the dragon? It doesn't look like anything like Psalm 74. It's in there cryptically, and I want to show you how. Here's the Babylonian creation story. Now, to understand what, the weirdness of some of these things, in the Babylonian thought, everything started with a watery abyss. There's just water. They don't know anything about elements. They don't know anything like that. They do know that things we see are probably made of smaller things. There's constituent elements. Remember from History of Civ, up until the modern era, people were trying to figure out what were the primary elements of the material world. Anybody know what the candidates were? I'll give you a hint. There was a rock group that was named
Earth, wind, air, and fire.
Yeah, earth, wind, fire, and air. Okay, there were four of them. Those were considered the primeval elements. Everything that we see is made out of those four things. That was primitive science. Before even the classical Greco-Roman articulation, the Babylonians named these constituent elements. They gave them deity names because there's only one thing that can exist before material things, and that must be gods. So we're going to just give these constituent elements God names, and we'll think of them as gods, because then we can talk about them. Because they don't know anything about science. They don't know anything about minerals and elements and all this stuff. So all the gods lived in this watery abyss. That's all there was. And the lead deity, Apsu, his name represents fresh water, is a major figure. And Tiamat lived in these waters, and she was a dragon. She's all cast as a dragon or a beast. Now the story goes that Apsu is disturbed by other gods in the abode because he hears that the other gods have a plan to destroy humanity, because humanity, they don't like the idea of humanity. Eventually, we get our material world and humans out of here. So when we get humans, Apsu hears of a plan to destroy them, and the plot's discovered, and eventually one of the gods kills Apsu so that he can get rid of the deity that's friendly to humanity. And this god, Ea or Enki, is known as Marduk in the Babylonian version. This is Sumerian. And he becomes head of the pantheon. So what you have happen is the primeval gods create the material world that humans know and humans. One of them gets torqued off at the humans and says, we're going to kill them off. The good guy in the pantheon, Apsu, says, I don't want to do that. We don't want that to happen. He eventually gets killed off, and the lead god here becomes Marduk. Marduk, though, doesn't get along with Tiamat. Again, if you're trying to come up with any logical meaning of this, just abandon it. They're trying to answer questions like, how did everything get here? Why is there conflict? What about, how do the gods treat people? Why do people die? Why do we have natural disasters like a flood? All this kind of stuff. So they make up this story. Part of the story is this conflict between Marduk and Tiamat. And essentially this gets retold by a conflict between a deity and a dragon. They have a fight, the dragon is destroyed, and Marduk takes her body, splits it, and makes a new heaven and a new earth. So you have a god defeating a sea beast, dividing the waters into heaven and earth. Does it sound familiar? Yeah. Deep here, the deep, is Tehom. It's the Hebrew equivalent of Tiamtu, which is Tiamat. The problem is, and it's not a problem, but in the Genesis version there is no battle. The battle's already happened. The battle of Psalm 74, killing the dragon, bringing order out of disorder. In the Genesis version, that's history. Chaos is already subdued. It's already under control. Darkness upon the face of the deep. We've had this conflict. Okay, there's no activity going on here because now, once the deep is still, God starts working. He starts bringing order out of the disorder, out of the formless and emptiness that was there. Okay, the stuff that's there. So it's actually, two stories just told at different stages. Now here's the point. You have stories about creation, whether they be in Genesis or Psalm 74. And what the writer's trying to communicate is that, first of all that we know in our world comes from God, who's the creator. To get there, God had to bring under restraint certain things that were part of the material stuff he was working with. Part of creation, there's something sort of built into it that must be restrained. And only God can be the restrainer. Only he has the power to make creation work as it should, so that people can live on it. Remember the New Testament, by him all things are held together and all things consist. Okay, there's a force there, God, Christ, that's holding everything together so that it works. But there's danger. You have this chaos stuff, part of the fabric of creation. And when we get to Genesis 1:31, God calls it very good. Notice that chaos isn't eliminated. Chaos is subdued, and out of chaos, out of the parts, of the dragon, we get our orderly world. But it's still in there. Okay, it's just framed and controlled and restrained. It's tamed. It's to the extent God wants it tamed. And God says, looks really good. This will work because what's the goal? This is a place where humans can live. Now on that place, I'm going to be there too. And my little slice of the pie is going to be Eden, and that will be completely perfect and without chaos. The rest of the globe is not. The rest of the globe is really good. It's wonderful. It's lush. It's ready for habitation. But Eden is even better. So we have a contrast between the absolute perfection of Eden in terms of life on earth, and we have, again, the globe as it is. There's an issue with, there's an element of danger, an element that needs to be held together, that needs God to hem it in, to control it. So if we go back to the questions here, creation isn't perfect. The entire creation isn't perfect. It's very good, but within it, there's just this element of something that needs to be restrained. Now, thoughts here, the second thought, the Genesis creation, again, couldn't be completely perfect, as in finished with no need for any change, for two reasons, or no improvement possible. Again, all creation wasn't Eden, and the new heaven and new earth naturally have to be better than this one. Now, part of that is because of the fall, but even before the fall, there was this sense that only God can hold this together. If God weren't active in holding it together, we'd be in big trouble. And there's this danger that, it can break forth and we can have problems. New heaven and new earth won't be like that. So for some reason, God deemed it desirable to leave this possibility for disruption in creation. For some reason, he decided to do that. It's not evil, because he wouldn't call evil good, but it's unpredictable, it's untamed, it is free. It's not programmed, it's not static. Creation is a reflection of God. Not God, it's a reflection of God. God is the only completely untamable thing, and creation is like him in a little way, because sometimes things just happen, because it behaves in a certain way, and earthquakes can be natural, rainfall, floods can be natural, fire is a natural force. Sometimes humans get harmed by those things. They're just part of creation. It's not perfect. Now, the ramifications. Why do natural disasters happen? Why do people suffer? Natural chaos is one of two reasons for suffering. That's the way creation is. It's untamed and it's unpredictable. The curses of the fall aimed at humans do not call for natural disasters. Have you ever noticed that when you get to the fall? The curses are about, women and childbirth, and men, having to work extra hard now to tame, to get food from the land and all this stuff. Things like lightning and fire and earthquake and flood, these are things that nature does. Humans just somehow get in the way, either because they're not wise or just because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay? God isn't trying to cause these disasters, they just are. So why would God leave creation like this? I would say it reflects his nature as being tamed and unpredictable. Romans 1:20, you can tell something about God from creation. God is not under restraint. He's not tamed. Eschatology is about reversing, making creation perfect. Now the other force is intelligent evil. So why do people suffer? Well, there's an element of that things happen because God has left creation wild. The other reason is intelligent evil. Eschatology plans to correct both. So here are the thoughts I want you to get. in terms of why the world is the way it is, part one, this is before the fall. Creation is good but untamed. It's not Edenic. Events at Eden suggest that that place was intended as this is what creation can be and will be if there's no sin. There's going to be a test here coming up. If there's no sin, if temptation is, survived, if it's avoided, if it's resisted, the potential is that every place can be like this. Every place can be Eden, because God wants to dwell on earth. He wants humans to dwell with him. When the kingdom of God spreads through the whole earth, then creation will be perfected. It's not completely perfect now. Only Eden is like that. Eden is the model of what it can all be. So when you get to eschatology, this is why the new heaven and new earth are Eden. Because then Eden is global. The entire earth. There's no threat of natural disaster. Okay, creation never, we're going to look at some passages on Sunday that describe the kingdom in terms of it's always abundant, earth is always abundant, no one ever gets sick, no one ever gets hurt, there is no death. Again, it's a perfected state. So Eden is that at the beginning, one little piece of earth, and earth is left as it is. And we want to see, God wants to see if humans will choose Eden over something else. And we get an external, temptation brought into that. So God's original plan to have Eden overspread the whole earth will eventually occur. That's where everything ends. That's how Revelation ends. We go back there. We also see a blended family, divine and human. Again, we'll talk about that yet this morning. But this was the ideal, and it's where everything will head. This is what it was at the beginning, trying to move toward that. Let's take 10, and we'll talk about intelligent evil, the other reason why life is the way it is. And what I'm going to do is once we get through the second part, I'm going to tie the two parts together, because God wants a kingdom on earth. He wants to live with humans. He wants humans to be in his family. He wants humans to be in his ruling bureaucracy, this thing we call the council. He wants humans to help run things that he's made. He wants his kingdom to be the entire globe. He wants all people, all nations, to be part of this family, this administration. What you get in Genesis is you get the seed beginning and the potential for harm, because there's a choice that needs to be made. And when the wrong choice is made, think about it, Eden is no longer. Eden disappears from the picture. That means there is no perfect state at all. That means everywhere humans live, they're subject to catastrophe from nature. And after the fall, that also means they're subject to the acts of intelligent beings who can choose to harm you. All of that could have been reversed. All of it will be reversed. But once the fall happens, humans are at the mercy of nature. They're at the mercy of intelligent evil. And the rest of the story is God's effort to restore rulership, restore the kingdom to earth. And that's a struggle. Even when he finally chooses Israel, when he finally says, I've had it with humanity, I'm going to just pick one nation. Even when he does that, good grief, the Israelites, what a struggle. Even when they get to the land, they screw up. I mean, it's a constant struggle. It's victories and it's losses. It's ups and mostly downs. But everything is inching along. And God tells us at several points, after the exile, when the worst disaster possible has happened, this is when God comes up with the new covenant. when he says, I'm going to just take it on myself to deliberately always have a remnant on earth. I am going to win. Okay, the destiny of this planet, I am decreeing the end. I'm letting people do their thing because they're imagers. They are me. They're reflections of me. And if I took their free will away and just decreed it, right now, kingdom, I would have to take away their image, their imaging status. I'd have to take away their freedom. Then they wouldn't be like me anymore. But I'm great enough. I am greater than evil. Every time evil wins, I am God. I will take that evil and I will steer it to the end that I'm determining. I will win. And I will have my way. And so you have this whole story. Earth waiting to be redeemed, waiting to be made perfect. Humans, you have believers, waiting for the final culmination of the kingdom. Will it happen in our lifetimes? You have the enemy thinking that they can win. Why? Because they've won lots of times already. They even infiltrated Eden. Okay? They even had an infiltrator there and managed to forestall the program. If we can pull it off then, that kingdom, we can pull it off in this kingdom too. They really think they can win because they know they're free to act and they've had victories before. And we were talking during the break, this is why prophecy was cryptic the first time. God didn't telegraph what the Messiah would be exactly. Where's the Old Testament passage that has the Messiah being God in the flesh? There isn't any. Why is it that the disciples, couldn't look at Isaiah 7 and think Messiah? Because the word Messiah is not used in Isaiah 7, in the virgin birth passage. And the virgin birth passage is fulfilled in Isaiah's own lifetime. Isaiah tells you that. Okay, in the next two chapters. Nobody ever reads beyond verse 14. Okay? But Matthew later on sees a connection. How does he do that? Why are the disciples so stupid? They're not. Why does Jesus tell them, only after the fact are you going to understand this? Because that's the way it was designed. We're going to have a whole session on the cryptic nature of prophecy because I take Paul seriously when he says, had the rulers of this world known, had the powers of darkness known, they would have never killed him. Because that was the end. That is the pivotal event for everything that follows. And not only that, that's the pivotal event for where everything was leading. Mm-hmm. So had they known, they would never have done this. But they didn't know. Because it was never spelled out. And all this stuff, these are just the little threads here. You've got, again, this whole, why are we in this mess? It's because, it's partly because God made creation. He didn't make it perfect. He left it untamed because it's like him, and said, okay, we're going to make it this way. Now we're going to put Eden on the planet, and you're going to make a choice. You're going to make a choice. Because God knows that it's going to be infiltrated. He's not like stunned that there's rebellion, because he made divine beings free too. This is why the image is plural. In Genesis, let us create humankind in our image. Okay, God is speaking to the members of his heavenly host. Okay, in some way, we and them are alike, and we're also like God. Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve sin, what does God say? Now they've, man and woman have become like one of us, knowing good and evil. What does that mean? Well, there's just, it refers to the loss of, in Adam and Eve's case, it's the loss of innocence. Now they know what it means to make a decision, okay, and to act independently, to act, on their own authority. Divine beings already know that. God certainly already knows that. Humans didn't know that because they were in an ideal environment. They'd never been, steered in any direction. They'd never been tempted or anything like that. So you have this element of, do we want Eden, or do we want, this thing that's less than Eden with all its risks? Do we want to obey God, or do we want to be gods ourselves? And based on those decisions, you have everything lost. They're left to the forces of nature. They're left to intelligent evil. They're left to their own devices. You want to be your own God? Fine. We'll see how that works. And it's God's effort to not give up. I mean, it's not like God has to think about giving up, because God knows the end from the beginning. There's a place He's steering it. But He can't, because He made us like Him. He's not just going to step in and say, man, that thing of making you like me, that just didn't work out. So now I'm going to make you robots and I'm going to play. Everything's a chessboard now. I think every thought for you. You're not like Him if He does that. Okay, the image is undone. It's erased. Okay, so God has bound Himself. God has taken the risk, if you don't want to use that. I mean, it's not a risk to Him. It's a risk to us, because we're less than God. It's like, God isn't creating a bunch of robots, and some of them I'll just make not like me, because that might be fun, and other ones I'll make like me, because I kind of want that too, and I will just play a game. He's not doing that. He wants creatures like Him to love Him, to make these choices. And when they fail, He's going to step in and steer the ship without removing your image, without removing who you are, without changing what you are as an imager of Him. And because of our nature, that takes a while. But again, God, look at what God does. He steps into history at key moments. He says, I need this to happen. I need Israel out of Egypt. I have heard the cries of my people. Now is the time. Okay? In the fullness of time, God sent for, He steps in at key places and said, now's the time to do this. Now's the time to start that. He intervenes. Okay, He intervenes. But then He says, now we've done this, now we're going to use people. I'm going to influence people to do the right thing. I'm going to influence people to move this along. And some of them are going to rebel. Some of them are just evil. Evil's going to happen. But we're going to beat it. We're going to beat it. And I'm so powerful, I'm going to do it without robotizing everybody. I don't need to do that. Again, these are just kernel thoughts. But let's take 10, and we'll get into some of the fall stuff with free will and all that kind of thing.